What if the most dangerous failures in medicine do not come from sabotage, greed, or broken machinery, but from a number that looks correct on a screen? In pharmaceutical laboratories, danger rarely announces itself with alarms or explosions. It arrives quietly, hidden inside decimals, tolerances, and calibration curves that appear normal to anyone who is not looking for the wrong thing. The lab where this story begins was considered exemplary. Clean rooms maintained under strict environmental controls, validated equipment, redundant quality checks, and compliance certificates framed on the walls. Every surface gleamed. Every process was documented. Every batch was logged. On paper, nothing could go wrong. And that was precisely the problem. At the center of the operation was a critical analytical instrument responsible for verifying compound concentration during synthesis. Its job was simple in theory: confirm that active pharmaceutical ingredients stayed within safe limits before moving to the next production stage. The technician assigned to the instrument was experienced, trained, and trusted. He had performed calibrations hundreds of times before. This one felt no different. But pharmaceutical manufacturing is unforgiving. Unlike other industries, small deviations do not degrade performance gradually. They flip outcomes. A difference of micrograms can transform a therapeutic dose into a toxic exposure, and the calibration procedure that morning introduced exactly such a deviation, subtle enough to pass unnoticed, yet powerful enough to poison an entire production line. The miscalibration did not produce an error message. The system reported values comfortably within acceptable ranges. Charts looked clean. Statistical controls showed stability. In reality, the instrument had shifted its baseline, compressing readings just enough to underreport concentration levels. The compound flowing through the reactors was stronger than anyone realized. Not dramatically stronger, just enough. From that moment on, every subsequent decision was built on false confidence. Operators adjusted parameters based on trusted data. Supervisors approved batches without hesitation. Quality assurance signed off results that appeared flawless. The system worked exactly as designed, but the foundation was already corrupted. This is how industrial disasters often unfold in high-tech environments. Not with chaos, but with routine. Not with obvious negligence, but with competence operating on bad information. The technician followed procedure. The software followed logic. The lab followed protocol. And still, the factory began producing something it never intended to make. What makes pharmaceutical failures uniquely dangerous is their delayed impact. Unlike explosions or fires, contamination can travel silently through supply chains, into packaging, distribution centers, pharmacies, hospitals, and finally into human bodies before anyone realizes a mistake was made. By the time the consequences surface, the original error is buried under layers of paperwork and assumptions. Inside the lab, production continued uninterrupted. Metrics looked strong. Output met targets. Management praised efficiency. No alarms sounded. No red flags were raised. Yet with each completed batch, the concentration drift compounded, embedding toxicity into products designed to heal. The most unsettling part of this story is not that a technician made an error, is that the system surrounding him was not built to question success. When numbers look good, production accelerates. When reports align, scrutiny fades. Over time, vigilance erodes, replaced by trust in instruments, software, and past performance. This is where the true danger lies. Industrial systems are designed to detect failure, not subtle success built on false premises. The lab was optimized to catch deviations, but blind to consistency rooted in miscalibration. The poison factory did not emerge from recklessness, but from precision misapplied. As the contaminated products moved forward in the process, no one suspected that the lab had crossed an invisible threshold. A single adjustment, performed in minutes, had initiated a chain reaction that would take weeks to surface and far longer to fully understand. And when the first external signs finally appeared, investigators would struggle to trace the origin back to this quiet moment, this routine calibration, this seemingly harmless shift in measurement that no one thought to question. If this story is already making you uncomfortable, it should. Hidden industrial failures like this one are far more common than most people realize. Take a moment to leave a comment, sharing what you think is more dangerous in environments like this: human error, over-reliance on machines, or blind trust in data. Your perspective matters here. If you want to keep understanding how small technical mistakes turn into large-scale industrial disasters, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part of this investigation. From the outside, the laboratory looked like the definition of safety. Temperature tightly regulated, humidity monitored down to decimal points, air pressure differentials carefully balanced to prevent cross-contamination. Every technician wore sterile garments. Every movement followed standard operating procedures written to satisfy regulators and reassure executives. It was an environment designed to inspire confidence, and that confidence became its greatest weakness. Modern pharmaceutical labs depend heavily on measurement systems. Sensors, analyzers, and automated instruments form the nervous system of production. They do not merely observe reality, they define it. What they report becomes truth. And when one of those systems drifts out of alignment, reality drifts with it. In this case, the miscalibrated instrument did not exist in isolation. Its data fed directly into multiple downstream controls, mixing ratios, reaction times, dilution stages, and purification thresholds all adjusted automatically based on those readings. The lab was not just controlled, it was interconnected. One faulty reference point quietly influenced everything else. The illusion of safety was reinforced by redundancy. Multiple checks existed, but they were designed to validate consistency, not correctness. When one system agreed with another, confidence increased, but when both systems relied on the same flawed calibration baseline, agreement meant nothing. The numbers matched each other perfectly, while drifting away from physical reality. Quality control reviews focused on trends. Were values stable? Were deviations within historical limits? Were charts smooth and predictable? The answer was yes. Stability was mistaken for safety. No one asked the more dangerous question: stable compared to what? This is a known vulnerability in high-reliability industries. Control systems excel at detecting change, but struggle to detect slow, systematic drift. When errors occur suddenly, alarms trigger. When they develop gradually, they blend into the background. The lab did not fail violently. It failed politely. Compounding the issue was organizational structure. Responsibilities were segmented. Technicians trusted instruments. Supervisors trusted technicians. Quality assurance trusted validated processes. Management trusted reports. Each layer assumed the layer below had verified reality. In truth, no one was verifying the foundation anymore. Audits did occur, but they focused on documentation and compliance. Calibration records were complete. Signatures were present. Procedures had been followed. The problem was not the absence of rules, but the assumption that rules guaranteed correctness. Regulators inspect what can be seen on paper. Contamination born from numbers that look reasonable often escapes notice. The lab also suffered from operational pressure. Production schedules were tight. Delays were expensive. Any pause required justification. Questioning a validated instrument without obvious evidence felt risky, even disruptive. Silence was rewarded. Doubt was not. Over time, subtle warning signs emerged. Minor inconsistencies between theoretical yield and actual output. Slight changes in reaction efficiency. Marginal increases in waste during purification. Each anomaly had an explanation. Normal variability. Raw material differences. Environmental noise. None were alarming enough on their own to stop production. This is how normalization of deviation takes hold. Small discrepancies become accepted as background noise. Once accepted, they stop triggering curiosity. And when curiosity disappears, disasters gain room to grow. The most dangerous aspect of this environment was not technology, but certainty. Everyone believed the system was under control because the system said it was. Measurements became unquestionable authorities. Human judgment retreated in the face of automation. Inside this controlled space, the poison factory did not feel like a failure in progress. It felt like business as usual, and that false sense of control allowed the contamination to deepen, batch after batch, unnoticed. Only later would investigators realize that the environment designed to prevent harm had quietly optimized its concealment. And as the product moved closer to distribution, the distance between error and consequence grew harder to bridge. Inside the lab, no one believed they were choosing speed over safety. That choice rarely feels explicit. It emerges gradually, shaped by targets, incentives, and silence. Production goals were framed as efficiency improvements. Faster turnaround meant competitive advantage, higher yield meant better margins, and every successful batch reinforced the belief that the system was working. Pharmaceutical manufacturing operates under constant pressure. Development timelines are aggressive. Market windows are narrow. Delays ripple outward, affecting contracts, supply commitments, and investor expectations. In this environment, stability becomes currency. Anything that threatens continuity is treated as friction. After the miscalibration, the lab did not experience disruption. Quite the opposite. Throughput improved slightly. Variability appeared reduced. The numbers looked better than before. Management interpreted this as optimization paying off. Meetings highlighted performance gains. Dashboards showed green indicators. There was no incentive to slow down and ask why improvements had appeared without intentional change. This is where industrial psychology becomes dangerous. When results improve, questioning them feels counterintuitive. Raising concerns in the absence of visible failure can be perceived as resistance or incompetence. Technicians learn quickly which questions are welcomed and which are quietly discouraged. The technician who performed the calibration noticed nothing unusual at first. Later, he sensed that something felt different. Reaction curves behaved more predictably. Fewer adjustments were needed. But predictability in complex chemical processes can be deceptive. It may signal control, or it may signal that measurements are no longer reflecting reality. Reporting uncertainty in such an environment carries risk. There was no clear anomaly to point to. No alarm threshold had been crossed. Expressing doubt would mean challenging validated systems and possibly halting production. That decision would not be taken lightly, especially by someone several layers removed from strategic authority. Supervisors, meanwhile, were focused on maintaining flow. Their metrics were time, volume, and deviation rates. Safety was assumed to be embedded in compliance. As long as procedures were followed and numbers stayed within limits, the operation was considered safe by definition. This is how safety becomes abstract. It exists as a concept, not as an active process. When nothing goes wrong, it fades into the background. Productivity, on the other hand, is visible every day. It is measured, discussed, rewarded. The pressure intensified as demand increased. Orders needed to be fulfilled. Distribution schedules were set. Pausing production would have meant explaining delays upstream and downstream. No one wanted to be the person who stopped a functioning line based on intuition alone. Over time, small warning signs were reinterpreted through a productivity lens. Slightly higher potency readings were seen as efficiency gains. Reduced batch losses were framed as process maturity. Each positive narrative pushed safety concerns further out of focus. In complex systems, success can be more dangerous than failure. Failure demands attention. Success invites complacency. The lab did not drift into danger because it was chaotic, but because it was performing well. This pattern repeats across industrial disasters. When performance metrics improve unexpectedly, they should trigger investigation, not celebration. But in practice, improvement is rarely questioned unless it creates new problems. Here, the improvement itself was the problem. As production accelerated, the contaminated batches moved closer to release. Documentation reflected confidence. Approvals came faster. What had begun as a technical deviation was now reinforced by organizational momentum. And once momentum takes hold, stopping it requires authority, evidence, and courage. None of those were readily available at the moment they were most needed. At the edge of this process, a quiet question lingered, unspoken but persistent. When systems reward output and punish hesitation, who is responsible for noticing when efficiency turns lethal? Industrial failures often get reduced to a single name, a single role, a single mistake. In reality, the most dangerous errors rarely belong to one person alone. They emerge at the intersection of human judgment and complex machines, in the space where responsibility becomes blurred and assumptions quietly replace verification. The technician at the center of this incident was not inexperienced. He had years on the job, formal certifications, and a record of reliable performance. His daily work involved calibrating instruments that few others fully understood. That expertise earned him trust, and that trust gradually transformed into invisibility. No one questioned his results, because they had never needed to before. Calibration is often treated as a routine task, but it is one of the most critical operations in any pharmaceutical facility. It defines what the system considers real. Once the reference point is set, every subsequent measurement aligns to it. If that reference shifts, the entire process shifts with it. The miscalibration occurred within acceptable procedural boundaries. The technician followed the checklist. He used approved standards. He documented the process correctly. Yet a subtle mismatch between the reference material and the instrument response went unnoticed. It was not a dramatic failure, but a quiet misalignment, small enough to slip past procedural safeguards. This is where the human blind spot emerges. People trust processes they have executed successfully many times. Familiarity reduces perceived risk. When an action has never caused a problem before, the brain categorizes it as safe. This cognitive shortcut is efficient, but dangerous in high-precision environments. The equipment, meanwhile, behaved exactly as designed. It produced consistent outputs. It reported stability. It did not flag an error because, within its logic, nothing was wrong. Machines do not understand consequences. They only enforce parameters. If parameters are flawed, machines will enforce flaws with perfect consistency. What makes this interaction so dangerous is the illusion of control it creates. The technician trusted the equipment because it was validated. The organization trusted the technician because he was competent. Each layer reinforced the other, closing the loop against doubt. There was no malicious intent, no corner cutting, no conscious negligence. And that is precisely why these failures are so hard to prevent. Safety systems are built to stop reckless behavior. They are less effective at catching competent people making small, reasonable decisions that accumulate into catastrophe. Another blind spot lies in how responsibility is distributed. Calibration errors are often discovered long after the moment they occur. By then, the technician has moved on to other tasks. Supervisors have approved outputs. Quality assurance has signed off results. The system diffuses accountability across time and roles, making it difficult to pinpoint when intervention should have happened. Training programs emphasize how to perform procedures, not when to distrust outcomes. Questioning data without obvious justification can feel like questioning one's own competence. In cultures that reward certainty, doubt becomes uncomfortable. The technician noticed nothing that demanded immediate action. No alarms, no abnormal readings, no deviations beyond acceptable limits. Everything appeared normal. That normality became the trap. The most dangerous blind spot in industrial systems is not ignorance, but confidence. Confidence in instruments. Confidence in experience. Confidence in routines that have worked 1,000 times before. And as this confidence solidified, the poisoned batches continued to move forward, carrying with them the silent imprint of a single moment when a human and a machine agreed on something that was fundamentally wrong. Once the contaminated batches left the controlled environment of the laboratory, the mistake gained momentum. Inside the factory, every step was buffered by assumptions of correctness. Outside it, those assumptions became invisible shields that allowed the product to travel unchecked through systems never designed to question its origin. After final synthesis, the compound entered formulation. Here, active ingredients were blended, stabilized, and prepared for dosage. The formulations were calculated based on concentration data provided by the same analytical chain that had already drifted out of alignment. No independent verification occurred at this stage, because the upstream data was considered authoritative. Packaging followed. Labels reflected approved specifications. Dosage instructions were printed based on validated potency ranges. Each box represented trust, not just in the drug, but in the entire industrial ecosystem behind it. Pharmacies, hospitals, and distributors rely on that trust to function at scale. The first opportunity to detect the error outside the factory was during post-production quality sampling. But sampling protocols are statistical, not exhaustive. A small subset of units is tested, not every dose. The contaminated product did not deviate dramatically from expected values. It sat just inside acceptable margins, close enough to pass, far enough to cause harm. Distribution accelerated the problem. Shipments moved across regions and countries. Warehouses stored inventory without knowledge of its hidden risk. By the time the first unit reached a patient, the error was no longer a technical anomaly. It had become a public health exposure. What makes pharmaceutical contamination especially dangerous is its delayed manifestation. Patients do not immediately associate adverse reactions with manufacturing errors. Symptoms appear gradually. Doctors suspect side effects, allergies, or underlying conditions. The idea that the medication itself is fundamentally flawed emerges only after patterns form. Early cases were isolated. A patient reported unexpected reactions. Another experienced symptoms inconsistent with dosage. These incidents were documented, but not connected. Pharmacovigilance systems are designed to detect trends over time, not single events. Until volume accumulates, signals remain weak. As reports increased, the signals strengthened. Clusters began to appear. Similar reactions across different locations. Similar products, similar times. Only then did investigators start looking backward, tracing supply chains, comparing batch numbers, examining production records. By this point, weeks had passed. Thousands of units had been consumed. The error had traveled farther than anyone anticipated, protected by layers of institutional trust. Inside the company, panic replaced confidence. Emergency reviews were launched. Teams combed through logs, calibration records, and batch histories. Everything appeared compliant. That compliance slowed discovery. Investigators initially assumed misuse, storage errors, or external contamination. The idea that the factory itself had become a source of poison was almost unthinkable. Eventually, attention returned to the lab. Retesting revealed discrepancies. Independent measurements showed concentration levels higher than documented. The numbers no longer matched. The invisible error finally became visible. But by then, the cost was already measured in human impact. Patients affected. Treatments interrupted. Trust eroded. What began as a minor calibration deviation had crossed the boundary between industrial error and real-world harm. This is the moment where technical failures transform into ethical ones. When systems designed to heal cause injury, responsibility expands beyond procedures and protocols. It touches leadership, oversight, and the fundamental question of how safety is understood and enforced. The path from production line to patient is long, but once an error enters it, stopping its spread becomes exponentially harder. Each additional step adds distance between cause and effect, making prevention less likely and consequences more severe. And as investigators closed in on the source, another unsettling realization emerged. The system had not failed once. It had failed repeatedly, quietly approving each step along the way. If you were responsible for catching this error earlier, where do you think the final safety net should have been? Leave a brief comment with your perspective. By the time investigators began connecting patient reports to a single source, the warning signs had already existed for weeks. They simply did not look like warnings at the time. In complex industrial systems, danger rarely announces itself as a clear anomaly. It whispers through data points that appear explainable, tolerable, and easy to dismiss. Inside the company's monitoring systems, subtle irregularities had been recorded almost from the beginning. Slight shifts in stability profiles, minor deviations in secondary assay results, marginal increases in adverse reaction reports that did not cross predefined thresholds. Each signal, LIVED, in isolation, stripped of urgency by design. Pharmacovigilance relies heavily on statistical confidence. A single report means little. 2 reports suggest coincidence. Only patterns trigger escalation. This framework protects companies from reacting to noise, but it also delays response to slow-moving threats. The poisoned batches exploited that delay perfectly. Customer complaints were the first human signal, not accusations, but questions. Patients describing reactions that felt stronger than expected. Healthcare professionals noting that side effects appeared unusually intense for standard doses. These observations were logged, categorized, and filed. None were treated as emergencies. Data analysts reviewed the reports through historical lenses. Similar complaints existed for countless drugs. The system compared the present to the past and found nothing extreme enough to justify alarm. What it failed to do was compare the present to physical reality. Internally, some technicians noticed inconsistencies between theoretical models and observed outcomes. Reaction efficiencies did not align perfectly. Degradation rates behaved oddly. But modern industrial environments teach people to trust validated systems over intuition. When numbers disagree with expectations, expectations are adjusted. This normalization of deviation is one of the most dangerous behaviors in high-risk industries. When anomalies persist without immediate consequence, they lose their ability to provoke action. They become background noise. Warnings also suffered from fragmentation. Different departments held different pieces of the puzzle. Quality assurance saw stability data. Medical affairs saw patient reports. Production saw yield improvements. No single team saw the whole picture. Without integration, signals remained incomplete and non-threatening. The company's escalation protocols required clear triggers, defined thresholds, confirmed trends. By the time those thresholds were reached, exposure had already occurred. The system responded exactly as programmed, but far too late. The turning point came when an external laboratory conducted independent testing. Their results did not align with the manufacturer's data. Concentration levels were higher. Toxicity markers were present. What internal systems had normalized? Outsiders immediately questioned. That discrepancy forced a re-examination of assumptions. Retesting began. Instruments were cross-checked. Calibration. Histories were reviewed with fresh skepticism. Only then did the miscalibration emerge as a plausible origin point. The realization was chilling. The data had been speaking all along. It simply had not been believed. Numbers that should have raised concern were filtered through frameworks designed to protect efficiency and continuity. Late warnings are often described as failures of detection. In truth, they are failures of interpretation. The signals were present. The context to recognize them. As dangerous was missing. As emergency recalls began and public statements were prepared, leadership confronted an uncomfortable truth. The disaster was not sudden. It had unfolded slowly, in full view of systems that lacked the courage to interrupt themselves. And as the investigation moved forward, attention turned to the moment when denial gave way to recognition. The exact point where the company could no longer explain away what the data was finally making impossible to ignore. Discovery did not happen in the laboratory where the error began. It happened elsewhere, where assumptions held less power and curiosity was not constrained by internal narratives. An independent testing facility, tasked with verifying samples during a routine external review, noticed something that did not fit. The results were not dramatically off. That was the unsettling part. The concentrations were elevated, but not enough to scream sabotage or gross negligence. They were elevated just enough to suggest danger under prolonged exposure, enough to turn therapy into toxicity. At first, the external analysts questioned their own instruments. They recalibrated. They repeated the tests. They ran controls. The numbers persisted. Confidence shifted away from self-doubt and toward concern. The samples were not behaving like legitimate pharmaceutical products should. When these findings were communicated back to the manufacturer, the initial response was defensive. Internal data showed compliance. Historical records confirmed validation. There was no obvious explanation for the discrepancy. For a brief moment, the possibility of laboratory error on the external side was considered. That assumption collapsed when additional independent labs replicated the findings. The pattern became undeniable. The product leaving the factory carried concentrations inconsistent with its documented specifications. Emergency protocols were triggered. Production halted. Distribution was frozen. Inventory was quarantined. What had once been a symbol of industrial precision now sat under suspicion, its legitimacy unraveling in real time. Inside the company, crisis teams formed. Meetings stretched late into the night. Legal counsel, quality leaders, engineers, and executives crowded into rooms filled with charts, timelines, and data that no longer aligned. The question shifted from what happened to how it could have happened without being seen. As investigators retraced each step, the miscalibration surfaced as the common thread, not as an obvious fault, but as a quiet divergence. A moment where measurement ceased to represent reality, yet continued to drive decisions. The most disturbing realization came when toxicologists modeled patient exposure. Individually, doses appeared marginally high. Over time, they accumulated. The compound had been designed for narrow therapeutic windows. The margin between healing and harm was thin. The miscalibration had erased it. Public health authorities were notified. Advisories were issued. Doctors were alerted. Patients were instructed to stop taking the medication immediately. Some had already experienced severe reactions. Others faced uncertainty, waiting to see if delayed effects would emerge. The narrative changed overnight. What had been a trusted medicine was now labeled a hazard. Headlines followed. Confidence collapsed. Questions spread faster than answers. Inside the lab, the technician learned what had happened. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, just silence and disbelief. A single routine action had become the focal point of a national investigation. The weight of that realization was crushing, but the deeper truth was larger than one person. The discovery exposed a system that mistook validation for vigilance, compliance for safety, and consistency for correctness. When the medicine was proven to be poison, the illusion that had protected the error dissolved. What remained was an uncomfortable task of explaining how such a transformation had gone unnoticed for so long. And as accountability discussions began, attention turned to the fallout. Not just legal consequences, but the human cost, the institutional damage, and the ripple effects that would extend far beyond a single company. Once the recall became public, the damage expanded faster than the company could contain it. What had started as a technical failure was now unfolding as a human crisis. Patients demanded answers. Families wanted accountability. Doctors questioned every prescription that had passed through their hands. The abstract language of process control suddenly collided with real suffering. For patients affected by the contaminated drug, the consequences varied. Some experienced acute reactions that required hospitalization. Others faced long-term complications that would take months or years to fully understand. A medication meant to restore health had introduced fear into daily routines. Every symptom became suspect. Every lingering effect raised new questions. Medical professionals were caught in the middle. Physicians had trusted the drug's safety profile. Pharmacists had dispensed it according to approved guidelines. Now they had to explain to patients why something prescribed with confidence had become dangerous. The erosion of trust was not limited to one product. It spread across therapeutic categories, fueling skepticism toward pharmaceutical assurances as a whole. Legal consequences followed quickly. Lawsuits multiplied. Patients accused the company of negligence. Regulators opened formal investigations. Internal emails, calibration logs, and decision records were subpoenaed and dissected line by line. What had once been routine documentation became evidence. The company's leadership faced intense scrutiny. Questions focused not only on the original miscalibration, but on oversight, culture, and response time. Why were early signals dismissed? Why were independent verifications not required sooner? Why did productivity pressures outweigh caution? Financial impacts escalated. Shares dropped. Partnerships were suspended. Insurance costs surged. The recall itself required massive logistical effort, retrieving products already dispersed across multiple markets. Warehouses filled with quarantined inventory that could never be used. Beyond immediate losses, reputational damage lingered. Pharmaceutical trust is fragile. Once broken, it is difficult to restore. Years of brand building were undone in weeks. Marketing campaigns stopped. New product approvals faced heightened skepticism. Regulators imposed additional audits, slowing future operations. Internally, morale collapsed. Employees struggled with guilt, fear, and anger. Some blamed leadership. Others blamed systems. Many blamed themselves. The technician at the center of the calibration error became a symbol, but also a reminder of how easily individuals are absorbed into narratives larger than their actions. The industrial consequences extended beyond one company. Competitors initiated internal reviews. Regulators issued new guidance. Industry forums revisited calibration standards and independent verification protocols. What had been treated as routine was now recognized as a critical vulnerability. This pattern is familiar in industrial disasters. One failure triggers reforms across an entire sector, but those reforms arrive after harm has already occurred. Safety improves only once the cost has been paid. The tragedy here was not just the harm caused, but the realization that it had been preventable. Multiple checkpoints existed. Each one had trusted the previous layer too much. Each one had assumed someone else was watching more closely. As investigations continued, the focus began shifting from punishment to prevention. What structural changes could prevent a similar failure? How could systems be designed to challenge success, not just failure? Those questions would define the next phase of the story, and they would force the industry to confront an uncomfortable truth. The most dangerous hazards are often hidden inside systems that appear to be working perfectly. The fallout did not remain contained within the walls of a single company. Once the details of the failure became public, the entire pharmaceutical industry felt the shock. What regulators, competitors, and investors saw was not an isolated mistake, but a systemic vulnerability that could exist anywhere precision depended on trust. Regulatory agencies reacted quickly. Emergency reviews were announced. Inspection schedules were accelerated. Laboratories that had not been audited in years suddenly found inspectors on site, examining calibration procedures, cross-checking reference standards, and questioning long-accepted practices. What had been considered routine was now treated as high risk. Companies launched internal audits of their own calibration. Logs were pulled from archives. Instruments were retested. Third-party labs were brought in to independently verify data that had previously gone unquestioned. In some facilities, small discrepancies were found. Not disasters, but reminders that drift was not hypothetical. Executives faced uncomfortable conversations with boards and shareholders. The question was no longer how efficient production could be, but how fragile the foundation of measurement really was. Risk assessments were rewritten. Budgets were reallocated toward verification rather than output. One of the most significant shifts occurred in quality assurance philosophy. Previously, consistency had been the gold standard. If systems produced stable results over time, they were assumed correct. After this incident, stability without external reference began to look dangerous. Independent confirmation gained new value. Technology vendors responded as well. Instrument manufacturers updated software to flag slow drift. New alerts were introduced to detect subtle baseline shifts, but technology alone could not solve the deeper problem. Systems still depended on human interpretation and organizational will. The incident also affected regulatory timelines. New drug approvals slowed. Authorities demanded more data, more cross-validation, more evidence that manufacturers understood not just how their systems worked, but how they could fail. While this increased safety, it also increased cost and complexity. Smaller companies struggled. Compliance became more expensive. Some facilities closed rather than adapt. Others merged, seeking scale to absorb the new regulatory burden. An era that began with one technician reshaped market dynamics. Perhaps the most lasting impact was cultural. Safety discussions became more explicit. Training programs emphasized skepticism alongside procedure. Employees were encouraged to question results that looked too good to be true. In some organizations, anonymous, reporting channels were strengthened to allow doubt without fear, but change was uneven. Some companies embraced reform. Others treated it as a temporary wave to ride out. History suggests that vigilance fades as memory does. Over time, pressure to return to efficiency reasserts itself. The domino effect revealed a paradox. Industries that save lives often operate on margins so tight that small errors carry enormous consequences. Precision is demanded, but questioning precision is discouraged. As the pharmaceutical world recalibrated its approach, one final lesson emerged. Disasters rarely announce themselves as singular events. They echo across systems, exposing assumptions that were invisible until they broke. And with the industry transformed, attention turned back to the original failure, not to assign blame, but to extract the lesson that mattered most. When the investigations finally concluded, the official reports focused on calibration, drift, procedural gaps, and oversight. Failures, but beneath the technical language lay a deeper lesson that extended far beyond instruments and protocols. What failed was not just a machine, but a way of thinking. The disaster exposed how modern industrial systems quietly redefine responsibility. Safety becomes a property of compliance rather than vigilance. Trust shifts from human judgment to automated outputs. Over time, people stop asking whether results make sense and start asking only whether they are allowed. The pharmaceutical lab did not collapse because rules were ignored. It collapsed because rules were followed without skepticism. Procedures were treated as guarantees instead of tools. Validation became a shield against doubt, not a trigger for it. This is why technical failures are rarely isolated. They thrive in environments where success is assumed to be proof of safety, where clean data replaces critical thinking, where consistency is rewarded more than curiosity. At the heart of this story was a single miscalibration, but that miscalibration survived because it fit comfortably inside an ecosystem optimized for efficiency. Every layer of the system worked as designed, and together, they produced harm. The most unsettling realization for investigators was how ordinary everything had been. No alarms, no dramatic violations, no villains, just competent people doing their jobs inside systems that discouraged interruption. This pattern repeats across industrial disasters, when engineers and technicians are trained to trust outputs more than instincts, when organizations punish delays more than doubt, when leadership equates productivity with control. Small errors are given room to grow. The lesson is not that technology is dangerous. It is that technology without friction is. Systems must be designed to challenge themselves, to distrust their own success, to force moments of pause even when everything appears to be working. True safety is not the absence of deviation. It is the presence of questioning. It lives in redundancy that does not agree to isolate, in audits that assume something is wrong even when nothing appears to be, in cultures where stopping the line is seen as responsibility, not failure. The lives affected by this incident were not lost to chance. They were lost to a chain of reasonable decisions that no one thought to break. That is what makes this story uncomfortable, and why it matters. Because the next poison factory will not look like a disaster in progress. It will look like a successful operation, running smoothly, hitting targets, and earning praise. Until it is too late. If you stayed until the end of this story, it means you understand how dangerous invisible failures can be. Take a moment to leave a comment writing the phrase hidden errors, kill, and share your thoughts on what should change inside high-risk industrial environments to prevent disasters like this one. If this analysis helped you see industrial safety from a deeper perspective, subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support this type of investigative storytelling. And now, don't stop here. Watch the next video appearing on your screen, where we break down another industrial disaster that started with a small mistake no one thought mattered.